Hey, everybody, welcome back to the Michael Lofton Show here on Reason and Theology. Let's talk about Pope Francis's new book where he gives an interview breaking silence on a number of issues, specifically criticisms that have been made about Pope Francis, as well as comments about his predecessor, Pope Benedict XVI, among many other things. I mean, there seems to be a lot going on with this. I woke up this morning after returning from my trip from Rome and Jerusalem. I woke up to a flurry of headlines about this new book interview from Pope Francis, and looking through some of the articles about it, it's incredible some of the subject matter that he is discussing. Famously, Pope Francis is known for not really engaging and responding to his critics. In my opinion, that has been overall very negative for him in this pontificate. It seems that in some cases he should respond to some of the critics. I'm not saying that you always have to respond to all critics, no, but in some cases I think it would be advantageous for him to respond to some of the criticisms and some of his critics. And on the whole, he has remained silent, but it looks like he is starting to speak out, which good for him. Okay, I'm happy to see this. So we're going to take a look at some of that, but I want to first remind you, hit that subscribe button. If you haven't already, go ahead and subscribe. And while you're at it, hit the like button. Okay, I want to take a look at several articles about this new book that kind of gives you some of the highlights of the book and the interview within the book. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. The first one comes straight from the Vatican News. And then we're going to take a look at a few others. This one is entitled, Pope Francis Remembers Benedict XVI in New Book. He was like a father to me, he says. In a new book interview, Pope Francis discusses his relationship with his predecessor, Benedict XVI. He always defended me. He never interfered. This is what I find incredibly fascinating, because he's going to show you that there are people who were trying to pit him against Benedict XVI, or the other way around. And in every instance, he says Benedict actually defended Pope Francis. So this is very consequential for people who say that, Benedict was still Pope. Pope Francis isn't actually a Pope. He's an anti-Pope. It sure seems that Benedict was under the impression that Pope Francis is Pope. So there's a lot of implications to the things that he starts to disclose about his predecessor. The article says Benedict was a man of great gentleness. In some cases, people took advantage of him, perhaps without malice, and limited his movements. Unfortunately, in a certain sense, they were encircling him. He was a very delicate man, but he was not weak. He was strong. He was humble and preferred not to impose, so he suffered a lot. This is just incredibly fascinating. We saw wild news about a year ago that Pope Benedict XVI was actually murdered by Pope Francis, and that there's this group surrounding Benedict that was, holding Benedict back from coming out and speaking the truth, that he's still the Pope, and that he's, being pressured by Pope Francis. And this actually shows the exact opposite, and indicates that actually there was a group of people around him that were trying to use him against Pope Francis, not as somebody who, was silenced from speaking the truth about the fact that he's still the Pope, and, he's basically a prisoner of Pope Francis, who some people claim later on murdered him without any evidence. We're now starting to get the truth, and it turns out to be the exact opposite of what people have been telling us. So Benedict was a man of great gentleness. In some cases, people took advantage of him. That's how Pope Francis remembers his predecessor, Pope Benedict XVI, in a new interview with journalist Javier Martinez Brocal, which will be released on April 3rd. He let me grow, explains the Pope. He was patient. And if he didn't agree with something, he would think 3 or 4 times before telling me. He let me grow and gave me the freedom to make the decision. So Pope Francis is saying, look, Benedict didn't always agree with some of the things that Pope Francis said, but he was respectful. And for the most part, didn't really say anything. And if he did approach him, again, it was very respectful, and he always submitted ultimately to Pope Francis's decision. Yet more evidence that Even Benedict himself recognized that Francis is the Pope and submitted to his magisterium, even when Benedict did not come to the same conclusions as Francis did. So true fidelity to the magisterium on part of Benedict XVI. I'm so happy to see that. Even when he wouldn't arrive at some of the same theological conclusions as as Francis, he would ultimately submit to his magisterium, the pontiff is going to show us. Pope Francis recounts his relationship with the Pope Emeritus over almost 10 years of cohabitation in the Vatican. He left me free. He never interfered. On one occasion, when there was a decision he didn't understand, he asked me for an explanation in a natural way, which is legitimate. If you have questions about the magisterium, if you're confused, you have questions about something that the Pope teaches, it's legitimate to ask questions. Nothing wrong with that. He told me, look, I don't understand this, but the decision is in your hands. A true son of the church, Pope Benedict. He recognized, look, even if I don't understand this, I am going to submit because this is within your authority. I love that. It shows that Benedict was not a dissenter. He was a loyal son of the church. And he shows us how we should embrace the magisterium with humility and docility. He told me, look, I don't understand this, but the decision is in your hands. I explained the reasons to him, and he was happy. In the book, Pope Francis explains that his predecessor never opposed any of his decisions. He never withdrew his support from me. Maybe there was something he didn't agree with, but he never said it. The Pope also remembers the circumstances of his farewell to Benedict on Wednesday, December 28th, 2022, when he saw him for the last time. So far from a story about Pope Francis and Ganswein murdering Benedict, you're going to get the real truth of what it was like between Pope Francis and Benedict in his last moments. Here it is. Benedict lay in bed. He was still conscious, but he couldn't speak. He looked at me, squeezed my hand, understood what I was saying, but couldn't articulate a word. I stayed with him like that for a while, looking at him and holding his hand. I remember his clear eyes. I said a few words to him affectionately and blessed him. That's how we said goodbye. With regard to the continuity between the pontificates, the Pope notes that what I see in the last popes is that each successor has always been marked by continuity and difference. Because in continuity, each one has brought his own personal charism. There is always continuity and no rupture. This is exactly what Benedict himself was saying in his 2005 Christmas address, when he spoke of the hermeneutic of reform, what's often called the hermeneutic of continuity. He speaks of continuity and reform. Maybe there's some areas of departure in small matters, but substantially there's going to be continuity. This is the way doctrinal development works. There's a continuity in the substance, while there may be some developments and changes and even rupture in accidental or side issues, if you will, or things that don't change the substance of the doctrine. The doctrine must remain the same substantially. Otherwise, we have an evolution of doctrine and we now have a corruption of doctrine, which is certainly not a Catholic position. Rather, that would be a modernist position. So, what we see here with Pope Francis is he is actually articulating the same perspective of doctrinal development as his predecessor, Benedict XVI, which, of course, is expressed by John Henry Newman, who himself got this same concept of doctrinal development from Vincent of Lérins, church father in the 5th century. So this is very, very traditional what Pope Francis is saying and articulating here. Getting back to the article, it says, Pope Francis also recounts a specific case in which he was defended by Benedict XVI. So Benedict actually would defend Pope Francis whenever some people were trying to pit Benedict against Francis. Watch this. I had a very nice conversation with him when some cardinals went to see him, surprised by my words about marriage. And he was very clear with them. One day, they showed up at his house to practically hold a trial against me. This is in reference to some of his comments about civil unions. He says they showed up at his house to practically hold a trial against him. and accused me to him of promoting same sex marriage. We've heard this once or twice, haven't we? Benedict did not get agitated because he knew perfectly well what I think. He listened to them all one by one, calmed them down, and explained everything to them. There was a time when I said that since marriage is a sacrament, it cannot be administered to same sex couples. Full stop. Haven't we been told the opposite? And yet here Pope Francis is saying, hey, I don't hold to that view. But somehow some civil guarantee or protection had to be given to these people's situation. I said that in France, there is the formula of civil unions, which at first glance can be a good option because they don't limit marriage. For example, I said three elderly pensioners who need to share health services, inheritance, housing, and so on can be accommodated. I meant that it seems like an interesting solution. Some went to tell Benedict that I was saying heresies. Again, we hear this narrative very, very often, and Pope Francis is responding to it. And good for him. Because again, one of the criticisms I have of Pope Francis in this pontificate is he has not sufficiently engaged some of his critics. I am, again, not saying that one should always address all of their critics. I certainly don't. I get nonstop criticism, nonstop slander, nonstop lies made about me, my wife, my family, my children, everything. I don't respond to 99% of it. 1% I'll strategically respond to. And I think, okay, maybe about 5% Pope Francis should strategically respond to, given the fact that he is a pope. And for the most part, he hasn't done so. So I'm actually happy to see that he's starting to engage some of this stuff. I mean, we're 11 years into his pontificate, but I don't think it's a day late, a dollar short. I kind of feel like better late than never. But if he had done this from day one and also been a little bit more careful in his off the cuff responses, you know what? I think a lot of the chaos in the church, a lot of the confusion could have been averted. There's some things he could have done better. Okay, so let's continue. He says, some went to tell Benedict that I was saying heresies. He listened to them and with great dignity helped them to distinguish things. Good old nuance, right? Benedict was giving them some nuance to these discussions. He told them, this is not heresy. Pope Francis says, how he defended me, how he always defended me. I love this. So Benedict, rather than accuse the pontiff of heresy, was actually defending him, especially in these comments on civil unions. Wow. I wish Pope Francis had told us this earlier. I feel like he should have said this before, but hey, again, better late than never. In the book, the Pope also responds to a question from the journalists about the books published at the time of Pope Benedict's death. Ooh. Francis replies, they caused me great pain. Gosh, I could see it. I saw Pope Francis. I was within 4 feet of him. And every single time I looked into his eyes, he looked like he was in a lot of pain. And a lot of that is physical pain because he's just physically not in great condition right now. But I could tell some of that was probably emotional as well. He gets a lot of attacks, a lot of slander. He says, they caused me great pain. That on the day of the funeral, a book that upset me was published, saying things that are not true, all very sad. You remember this? I covered some of this. On the day of his funeral, a book is published. He's talking about Ganswan here, the secretary of Benedict. Of course, it doesn't affect me in the sense that it doesn't condition me, but it hurt me that Benedict was used. Ooh. Yeah. Used, even on the day of his funeral. It was messed up. The book was published on the day of the funeral, and I experienced it as a lack of nobility and humanity. In other words, it was not respectful to Benedict on the day of his funeral to release this garbage, to release this stuff with things that just aren't true. Finally, the Pope reveals to Javier that he has already ordered a revision of papal funerals, explaining that the funeral vigil for Benedict XVI will be the last with the Pope's body outside the coffin. I don't think that will last long. I'm quite certain that a successor of Pope Francis will reverse that. So I don't think this is going to be a long-standing practice here. Popes should be watched over and buried like any other child of the church with dignity like any Christian. Okay, so that's the end of that article. Now we're going to get a little bit more substance, a little bit more details from this one. This is coming from Crux. Francis praises Benedict, but chides Ganswein, that is the personal secretary of Benedict, calls Cardinal Sarah, bitter in new book. Wow. You'll recall Cardinal Sarah has had this long history of calling for obedience to the magisterium, and then unfortunately in recent months has himself began to dissent from the magisterium and even accused the magisterium of heresy not long ago, which I covered on this channel. It's very sad to see that. In yet another new interview book to be published tomorrow, Pope Francis opened up about tensions between himself and the private secretary of his predecessor, Benedict XVI, German Archbishop Ganswein, who he said made things difficult for them. So he's going in on Ganswein. So you remember, basically Ganswein was kicked out of Rome. Well, you're going to find out why. Speaking to Spanish journalist Javier with ABC Espanol, Francis addressed comparisons between himself and Benedict, saying that such comparisons are normal, and that even Benedict was compared to John Paul II. It's pretty normal, right? Compare a successor with a predecessor. However, he said certain things were attributed to Benedict that weren't true, and voices belief that those who saw Benedict's resignation as the end of the church and as having caused enormous harm had a position that's a bit ideological. That's one way to put it. Pope Francis, without giving names, said Benedict once expelled someone who spoke badly about him from the Mater Ecclesiae monastery where Benedict resided, but he did it with gentleness. He was a gentleman. Wow. So Benedict wasn't tolerating some of this Pope bashing that we see out there. Benedict was not on board with it. He was a loyal son of the church. It gives us a really good example on how we should behave. Benedict had questions. Sometimes he didn't arrive at the same theological conclusions as the magisterium, according to Benedict, but he submitted to the magisterium at the end of the day. That's a loyal son of the church. Pope Francis, without giving names, said Benedict once expelled someone who spoke badly about him. Francis said that in turn, he once confided in Benedict that Ganswein, who served as Benedict's personal secretary throughout his papacy in the years after his resignation, did some very difficult things to me. Offering a concrete example, Pope Francis, without mentioning the name, said he once replaced the head of a Vatican department, and the decision generated some controversy. Well, I don't suppose there's a whole lot of options on who this could be, right? In the midst of all that noise, the secretary took the initiative to take him to see Benedict, since that person wanted to greet him. Since the Pope Emeritus was very kind, he accepted, Francis said, saying the problem was that they spread the photo of that meeting as if Benedict was answering my decision. Sound familiar? Oh, well, we see this all the time. People taking things out of context, twisting things, twisting articles, comments, photos, situations, videos, and so on. Honestly, it wasn't right, he said, saying many people wanted Benedict to be more forceful or directive in his years of retirement and enter the game of controversy, but he never did. You know why? Because Benedict was a loyal son of the church. He submitted to the magisterium. And look, this is someone who used to be the Pope, who used to be the visible head of the church. And even he, when he resigned, even he submitted to the magisterium, even when he didn't understand, even when he would not have arrived at the same conclusions. Wonderful example on how we should submit to the magisterium with docility. I was very happy to see this about Benedict. Asked whether he had consulted Benedict XVI about his decision to roll back Benedict's liberalization of the use of the traditional Latin Mass, Francis said he never spoke to Benedict about it, but that Benedict once defended him when he was facing criticism over his support for civil unions for gay couples. In fact, I think we've read elsewhere from Ganswein. Now, take it with a grain of salt. But Ganswein was saying that, that Benedict, kind of had some questions and was like, yeah, I don't know, scratching his head on that decision. Nonetheless, Benedict was a loyal son of the church and submitted to the papal magisterium. Shortly after the controversy over those remarks erupted, Francis said a group of cardinals went to see Benedict about it, and during the meeting, Benedict did not become agitated because he knew perfectly what I thought. He listened to all of them one by one, and he called them and explained them, distinguishing between civil unions and sacramental marriage, telling the cardinals that this is not a heresy. How he defended me, Francis said, saying this situation helped him understand that there were people who were half covered and who took advantage of the slightest opportunity to bite me. But Benedict always defended me. Man, I wish Pope Francis had been doing this from day one, had been responding to this stuff from day one. That would have been helpful. But again, better late than never. But I'm ultimately happy to see that at the end of the day, Benedict went to bat for Pope Francis when people were trying to twist things and try to use Benedict against Francis. Francis also touched on tensions with other Benedict supporters, referring specifically to the January 2020 book, From the Depths of Our Hearts, Priesthood, Celibacy, and the Crisis of the Catholic Church, which was published as having been co-authored by Benedict and Cardinal Sarah. At the time, the impression was that Benedict was siding with the conservative Sarah in defending priestly celibacy at a time when Pope Francis was weighing proposals to allow limited ordination of married men in some areas of the Amazon following the 2019 Synod of Bishops on the Amazon, which I don't know why this is even controversial, because we already have this with the Anglican Ordinariate in the Latin Rite. So, yeah, I mean, look at Father Dwight Longenegger, right? Married Catholic priest in the Latin Rite. So what Pope Francis was considering was something that's really already there for the Anglican Ordinariate. Well, to try to sabotage what Pope Francis was considering, what they did is they tried to spin this situation and pit Cardinal Sarah against Pope Francis. In the wake of the uproar, I felt obliged to ask Benedict's secretary to take a voluntary leave, maintaining his position as prefect of the papal household and also his salary, Francis said. Listen, you hear a lot about, Pope Francis is this evil dictator. I'm sorry, but I constantly see the opposite. He is overly indulgent with some of these people, because as we see, what Ganswein did after that was way out of bounds. So he even allowed him to keep his salary. Look, Pope Francis is a lot more merciful than I would be with some of these people. And maybe that's a criticism of me, right? Maybe that's a virtue of Pope Francis, but I think he's overly indulgent, and overly generous to some of the critics who take that generosity and then abuse it. Well, the first time that he crossed the line, he still let him keep his salary and his position. He described Sarah as a good man and a man of prayer, but voiced his belief that during his tenure as prefect of Vatican's Department of Liturgy, Sarah was immediately manipulated by separatist groups. Well, I have a question. Is Sarah currently being manipulated, or does he know better? I don't know, because when I see him accusing the magisterium of heresy, and I see him dissenting against the papal magisterium, which he has recently done, as I've covered on this channel, I have to ask the question, is this something that he does knowingly, or is he being manipulated? I suppose Pope Francis is giving him the most charitable understanding here, and that is that he's just being manipulated in some of these situations. Of course, he doesn't comment specifically on his comments on fiducia here. At times, I have the impression that working in the Roman Curia made him a little bitter. he said. So he says that he feels like Cardinal Sarah became a little bitter because of that experience working in the Curia. I don't know if that's true. Last year, following the death and funeral of Benedict XVI, Pope Francis sent Ganswein back to his native diocese in Germany with no official position, seen by many as a direct snub. But it was actually Ganswein who was snubbing Pope Francis. This is what I mean by, gosh, the guy was even still allowed to keep his salary, and he still continues to cross the line? And people think that Pope Francis is in the wrong for disciplining him? No, come on. Pope Francis's words were made in a new interview book called The Successor on his relationship with Benedict XVI, set to be published by Planeta on April 3rd. Speaking generically of his relationship with Benedict, Francis said he never stopped supporting me, and that even if Benedict disagreed with something, he never said it and would instead simply draw his attention to other aspects of a given issue. Sounds like Benedict to me, because if you read Donum Veritatis, that kind of shows you how to engage the magisterium, even when you personally are struggling with some of the things that it says. You know, it was actually Benedict when he was still Ratzinger who wrote that under the pontificate of John Paul II. So he actually practiced what he wrote down, really, in Donum Veritatis, it would seem. So he walked the walk. If there was a man who went forward, who was progressive, it was him, to the point that in the time of the Second Vatican Council, he was seen with suspicion. Even the decision to resign was a very advanced, very progressive, he said, praising Benedict as a great theologian. It has always caught my attention that he was one of the first to dot the I's at the Second Vatican Council to achieve reform. Francis said that while still Archbishop of Buenos Aires, he invited then Cardinal Joseph Ratzinger every time he came to Rome, while Ratzinger was prefect of the then Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith, to discuss things like episcopal appointments and the abuse crisis. Benedict, he said, acted with courage on the abuse issue and was serious about cleaning things up. And again, that's contrary to the narrative that we've been told, that Benedict was complicit in all this. He recalled how once then Cardinal Ratzinger had a meeting with officials at the Vatican Secretariat of State to address allegations against disgraced legionaries of Christ founder Father Marcial Degolando, and that he had brought a dossier on Marcial to the meeting. However, after the meeting, he had the dossier shelved, telling his secretary, take it back to the archive. The other party won. The reference was likely to a conflict between Ratzinger and the Vatican's then Secretary of State, Italian Sodano, Cardinal Sodano, who was close to the legionaries and opposed taking action against Marcial. Sodano's role was later made public by Cardinal Schönborn. Despite the setback, Benedict, Francis said, didn't put the case aside or let it go. He looked for the right moment, and years later, as Pope, the first thing he did was face the question and clean it up. He was a fighter who did not throw in the towel, who did not give up until he finished what he considered just. In 2006, as Pope Benedict removed Maciel from active ministry and sentenced him to a life of prayer and penance. Kind of feel like some others need the same direction at this point. I think Pope Francis may need to learn from his predecessor and do the same with some others out there today. Francis recalled how Benedict, prior to his resignation, defended him in 2011 when mid-level officials in the then Congregation for Bishops wanted him out of leadership. So had prepared something on his resignation when he reached the retirement age of 75 and had already selected a new name as the next Archbishop of Buenos Aires. So he was kind of expecting to just be done at 75 because of critics. And then Benedict actually defended him. Instead of accepting, however, Francis said that Benedict refused. So he refused his resignation, saying, I don't know why Cardinal Bergoglio has so many enemies here, and extended his mandate another 2 years. I mean, wow, this is big. Because, again, there are a lot of people out there that just say, oh, well, Benedict was really Pope, and Benedict was actually being pressured into saying the things that he said, but he was really opposed to Francis. Well, now we're getting the other side of the story. In fact, even when it came to Francis's retirement age as Bishop of Buenos Aires at 75, he rejected his resignation and extended his tenure there as Archbishop of Buenos Aires. Pope Francis said he believes Benedict's decision to resign was likely the most consequential decision he made. He said he heard about the resignation shortly after it was announced, and a journalist friend in Rome called him to give him the news and the details as things were happening. Recalling his first meeting with Benedict XVI after being elected Pope, Francis said it was 10 days after his election, and that during that conversation, Benedict handed him a box containing documents from the VatiLeaks scandal. Pope Francis is really going in here. By the way, he's also going to tell us a little bit about how he was elected and some of the stuff going on behind the scenes. And of course, he can do that because he's the Holy Father and he is above canon law as the Pope. Benedict suggested people he thought should be removed from their positions, Francis said, saying he took these suggestions. Francis said he never took seriously reports of tensions between he and Benedict, calling them nonsense. I didn't get into them. Well, you know what? This is again where I have some concerns with Pope Francis, with all due respect. This is part of the problem. Okay, yeah, it is ridiculous to try to substantially pit Benedict against Francis. I agree with Pope Francis on that point. I agree. But yes, it is nonsense. But he says, I didn't get into them. That was a mistake. I think that he should have. I think that he should have addressed some of those things head on. Again, some of those critics and some of those criticisms that have been floating around for a very long time, I think he should have just immediately addressed them, put the fire out before it really spread. So he's doing it now. Again, better late than never, but we could have averted a lot of confusion by addressing this stuff head on right when it came out. He said he met with Benedict regularly and that they discussed various things, such as the controversial synodal path reform process in Germany, which Pope Francis is very much opposed to, as I've covered on this channel. Pope Francis said he showed Benedict a June 2019 letter he had written to the leadership of the German bishops. Y'all remember that. I've covered that here. Very critical of the German bishops, warning that the process risked breaking church unity, saying, Benedict said that it was one of the most relevant and most profound documents that I had written. Well, I mean, there's no shocker there. I mean, right? I mean, I would be shocked if it was the other way around, if somehow Benedict was on board with the German bishops, right? I mean, so no shocker that he was on board with Pope Francis's criticisms of the German bishops. But it does go contrary to the narrative that Pope Francis is somehow on board with the German bishops. We spoke about everything with a lot of freedom, he said. Speaking of Benedict's passing, Francis recalled how he found out Benedict was not doing well through a nurse treating him, and that he had gone to visit Benedict after concluding his weekly general audience, during which he asked faithful to pray for Benedict. He said that he sat with Benedict for a while and said some tender words and gave him a blessing, but that while leaving with the nurse who informed him of Benedict's precarious health, one of the doctors present looked at the nurse disapprovingly and called them a spy. This is getting good. This is getting really good. We've heard a little bit about this, but it's always the other way around, right? But evidently there were some people surrounding Benedict that were trying to manipulate him in the situation. But again, it's the very opposite of what we've been told, which was that somehow Francis was manipulating him. Rather, it's the exact opposite. They were trying to manipulate Benedict against Francis. The attitude of those doctors was to keep everything closed. In some way, it made me understand that they had Benedict almost in custody, he said. Wow. So again, maybe there's a grain of truth that he was almost in custody, right? That he was almost a prisoner. But it's the exact opposite of what we are told. It wasn't Francis keeping him prisoner. It was rather the critics, some of the critics of Pope Francis keeping him in custody. This is Pope Francis saying this. It's quite shocking to see him so open and so candid, because I just haven't seen this side of Pope Francis before. He tends to be more closed and commenting on these kinds of things. And again, I think that that's to a fault. So it's somewhat refreshing to see him being so candid. Asked whether he would name Benedict XVI a Doctor of the Church, a prestigious title given to saints, seen as having made a significant contribution to theology or doctrine, Pope Francis said that right now the process of bestowing that honor is stalled. There was a sickness of religious congregations, which is to request that their founders be named as doctors of the church. I stopped it because if we start giving this title to everyone, it loses its meaning. But added that Benedict, of course, has the category to be one. So in other words, he totally thinks that Benedict is qualified to be a doctor of the church, but it's just too soon to do that. Because if we're just throwing this stuff out, we make it meaningless. Regarding rumors that he is planning to reform the rules governing how conclaves function, Francis said there's nothing to this. And that while all popes in the past century have modified the conclave in some way, true, he doesn't see a need to do so. So he's not going to be modifying, how popes are elected. Again, he can. That's within his authority, but he's not going to. In terms of future resignations from the papacy, the Pope voiced his belief that it depends on each person. Right now, the door is open. This possibility always existed, but Benedict opened it. Some ask me if I'm planning to resign. It's possible, but for the moment, I don't feel the need, he said. Oh, okay. So right now, doesn't look like he's going to resign, but it is a possibility that he may do so. We'll see. Let me read to you another article here, slightly different angle, has a little bit more details. By the way, this actually is a different article. I'm going to need to do a separate stream on this. This is the Vatican is going to publish a doctrine on moral questions regarding human dignity, gender, and surrogacy. I'll do a separate show on this. I thought I had the other article pulled up, but oh well. Wow, this is just, again, incredible here, seeing Pope Francis this open. I look forward to reading the book. It's in Spanish. I don't know if there is an English translation available yet. If y'all find one, let me know. I'm going to be getting a copy and having some people who read Spanish review it and give us some highlights from it. So more to come. So stay tuned for more. But if you do come across an English translation or something like that, go ahead and send it to me, reasonandtheology@gmail.com. I definitely want to take a look. It looks like he is going in on a lot of things. So how's my jet lag? Mahoval says, I don't really have it. By the way, thank you, Vincent. Hope you had a great time in Rome and Israel. Glad you're back. Yeah, it was awesome. Incredible experience. Got to go to papal general audience, a papal liturgy, plenty of masses at St. Peter's Basilica, among other places, which the masses were always done very well. They always had some Latin in them as well. Very, very respectful and reverent. I was just very impressed by the liturgies there. I was also impressed by how many people were there, enthusiastic about their faith, excited about being Catholic. Very different than the online discourse that we tend to see in the online environment that we might find on X and other platforms. Very, very different. People in Rome, Catholics from all over the world, had this vibrant faith, really excited about the Catholic Church and about our faith and about the liturgy. And it was just very refreshing. So I got to do all of that. I got to see plenty of amazing things like Roman catacombs, and also went to Jerusalem and a number of places in Israel. I'll do a separate stream, maybe talking about all of this in detail. I've posted some videos along the way, and I'll definitely be posting more. But that was also incredible. Been a long time. It was 28 years since I had been back to Israel, so I was really excited to go back. I went to some of the places where I grew up in Israel and got to see them again, and it was just wow, I really enjoyed the experience and got to go to a lot of places like the Holy Sepulchre and the Mount of Olives and the Kidron Valley, and all kinds of wonderful places described in the Bible, rich in history. And so stay tuned for more. I'll be talking about that soon. And there's plenty of other things that I noticed that were going on that I'll need to offer some commentary on, specifically with the German bishops, among other topics. So stay tuned for plenty of other streams and also patron exclusive content. I got a lot of that coming up, stuff that I'm going to post only for patrons. If you want to be a part of that, you want to support me, and you want to get access to that extra content, patreon.com/Reason and Theology, or become a channel member right here on YouTube. Either way, you'll get access to that patron exclusive content, plus other things, and you'll be supporting what I'm doing here. So if you appreciate R&T, if this has been a helpful channel to you, if you appreciate the commentary here, you find it valuable, go ahead and hit that subscribe button, and definitely consider supporting the channel, again, at patreon.com/Reason and Theology, or right here on YouTube by hitting the channel membership button and choose your participation level. Okay, so plenty more to come. Y'all stay tuned. Glad to be back. And thank y'all so much for praying for me. I was praying for y'all there in Rome and Jerusalem. All right, we'll see you later. Hey friends, do you want others to discover why the Catholic Church is the church that Jesus established? And do you want to help people make sense of all the confusion in the Catholic Church today? Help contribute to this mission by supporting Reason and Theology at patreon.com/Reason and Theology. By doing so, you'll also get access to exclusive content for patrons only. Also, if you want to deepen your faith, there are free ebooks and even courses that you can sign up for by visiting reason.podia.com. Are you a Catholic thinking about converting to Eastern Orthodoxy? Or are you a Protestant discerning whether or not to become Catholic or Eastern Orthodox? If so, I have the book just for you. It's called Answering Orthodoxy. It engages all of the arguments that Eastern Orthodox use against the Catholic Church. I respond to all of them. I show that they are in error, and in fact, they're inconsistent, because the things that Orthodox are objecting to are in fact found in their own tradition. So the fullness of the faith can only be found in the Catholic Church. Check out the book right now at shop.catholic.com for your copy today.